All right, so I'm Dom,
I am Jeff.
and I think it's time to refactor our player class.
Yeah. So last week we got to the point where uh, not only do we have a moving player, but we had a moving player that could bump into these other entities in the game that are walls, which are represented by these gray lines here. Um, and this is really cool. We now have some code, messy as it is, that will help us figure out how to do collisions against things that are aligned to a tile grid. Um, and practically speaking, our goal is going to be to also have this behavior in bullets. We can shoot bullets with our tank here, but the problem is the bullets don't run into the wall. And we'd like the bullets to not only bump into the wall, but maybe also interact with the walls. Maybe it'll damage the walls, right? Um, so we've already written a bunch of this code that's kind of tucked away into the player class, and we've been discussing a couple different ways of maybe sharing this code with the bullet class. Right now, the bullet class is a little bit sad. It kind of doesn't have too much going on besides just, oh, I don't know, having a velocity on the bullet and having the velocity update the position of the bullet itself. Um, so we talked a lot, or at least in whatever time we had at the end of last stream, about how to do this kind of reorganization. The model that we currently have in the player, both entities, really, players and bullets, is to have kind of this giant update function on each entity type that contains all the logic to handle what that entity is supposed to be doing. So for the player class, we have this input handling block here that checks for key presses. And then we do collisions against walls, which is really just this entire block and going down into a ton of other stuff. It's really just the rest of this entire update function. Probably like 50 or so lines of code. And when we started talking about moving this over into a common location that the bullet could access, we got into the philosophical conversation about whether or not we want to have all of this logic in a common base class for entities, uh, or if we should try to break things up and compose them a little bit more. Um, Dom, I don't know if you got a chance to read Bob Nystrom's article on components. Did you get a chance to skim that over?
I skimmed it, yeah.
Mm. Yeah, so he has like a really nice breakdown, and what I appreciated about what he framed it is he kind of started with the assumption that you have the kind of like Uber class that has all the logic in it. Um, and his explanation kind of goes into, I guess, specializations of interfaces, where I actually think it could be even more abstract than that.
Mm.
So I guess let me sketch out some of the ideas here. Is that coming through for you, Dom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, looking good so far.
Um, so the way we've got it currently is we've kind of got this like oh, I'm drawing black on black tool. Um, we have entity update that's like this, and what we're doing is we're doing input handling, and then we're doing motion or physics, and then we're doing collision. And collision, I think, can split up into two different categories. It can be collision against tile-aligned terrain. And I think that's kind of like what we have with the wall currently. The wall is tile aligned. We take advantage of the fact that everything is a tile in size, and we take some liberties with the math as a result of that. And the other thing that we're doing with this collision is we're also making sure that if there's any kind of overlap between the collision volumes or collision areas of different entities, that we make sure that there's no more overlap. So we'll actually physically push the player or whatever the moving entity is back away from its line of motion if it happens to get into an overlap with tile-aligned terrain, which is walls. And then there's collision, which we haven't really figured out yet, against other entities. And for this game, we're not doing things where like entities push other entities. We might do that, but we're not doing this collision detection in order to kind of make sure that there's no overlap between things. The second category of collision is more about just things like hit detection, right? So if a bullet is moving through space and it overlaps with an entity, we might want to just make sure that if there is an overlap, we detect it and then do something else with it, like destroy the bullet and replace it with an explosion or something like that, right?
Yep.
So this is currently player. And so the big question is, how do we share logic with other entity types, right? Such as the bullet. So strategy 1 is the Uber base class. So what that would mean in terms of the code is we just probably take all of this stuff and stick it into a base class called entity, and then just derive the bullet and player from that. And the big question with the Uber base class is, how do we make sure like that we're treating entities differently if they do have variations in behavior? And so the problem with the Uber base class is not one that we've run into today or maybe even next stream. But eventually what's going to end up happening is that all of the logic to handle all possible behaviors of every single entity type are going to be stuck in the same base class. And that just becomes pretty unwieldy and complicated to deal with, right?
Yeah. I really don't want to go down that path.
Okay.
I've experienced it.
Okay. So what's funny is it's complicated in, it's actually not complicated in the sense of code, or at least it's easy to just move all the logic into one location and just read it in line, right? So where it gets complicated is in figuring out how to do variations, how to make changes. So it's kind of subtle in the sense that the complexity doesn't hit us right away; it hits us like further down the line. And I think we're doing our best to not like over-engineer or over-abstract in this project, but I think there's also a sense that maybe doing the Uber base class up front is not going to really set us up for success. So what's the other strategy? Is something we're calling components, right? Or maybe composition instead of inheritance. Where what an entity looks like, this entity object, is it has like a world position, and then we basically kind of plug in different components. It has different slots for different components based on what it needs. So you might have a movable component, and you might have like a tile collision component, and you might have a bullet collision component, and maybe you also have like a keyboard handling component, right? Keyboard input. And the idea here is that your component is just a bag of functionality. And one way that, and okay, the question is like, what are these components? Well, components are, they can be state, and they can also be logic, which is interesting because state and logic are actually two pretty different things, right? Now, the component systems that I've seen kind of conflate these two things and say like, well, we're going to have some state. We're just assuming that there's some state in each of these components, and we're also going to assume that there's some logic. And so the way that we update an entity is we just iterate over all of the components and update each of the components, right? Now, what's funny about that is that something like a world position it is, I think, an example of a component that doesn't really have any logic, right?
No, it should be pure state.
I think one of the pieces of logic that a world position might have is to maybe remember the previous position at the start of the frame, something like that. But that's not even something that necessarily has to go inside the world position. So that's an example of a component that has state but no logic. And then maybe the inverse of that is something like the keyboard input component, where maybe keyboard input is really just updating other components. It's maybe setting the entity into different states. Maybe it's updating the world position because you're moving around. Or it's updating the movable component by setting velocity. But it doesn't necessarily have any state in and of itself, right? So I don't know what we want to do in terms of like separating state and logic, but there are a lot of different components. They have both, right? So something like a movable component is going to have state. It's going to have something like a velocity or an acceleration or something like that. But it also has an update where you do actually want to apply acceleration to the velocity every frame. You want to apply the velocity to the position every frame. So there may be other things that are like that as well. So now we get into the question of like how do we actually organize this in code, right? When you create an entity, maybe what you do is you just sort of create this. One way that you could do it is just an entity is an array. You have one array per entity, and you just sort of push these components into that array. And then when you update the entities, you just iterate over your entities. Then you iterate over that array of components and update on all of them, right? So that's one way to do it. And so the way that would look like, you're kind of, well, what did I just do there? One way that you could do is entity 0 is just a bunch of updates. Maybe you do component 1, component 0 update, component 1 update. And this is just a sort of time diagram. The time goes this way. Component 2 update. And then you move on to entity 1, and then it's component 0 update, and so on and so forth. You just go through your entities, right? And that's one way to do it. It's like the what you're updating your components while iterating over entities. And then it's funny. I've actually written games that kind of work this way, and it's fine. One of the other ways that I've seen this done, and I think it's probably more typical of the way this is done, is that rather than treating your entities as an array of structures, treat it as a structure of arrays, which is a little bit confusing, but maybe this will make it a little bit clearer. what you will do is you'll basically treat your components and entities like a matrix, right? So you'll have components on this side, and you'll have entities here. And let's say you have entity 0, entity 1, entity 2, so on and so forth. And here you have component 0, component 1, component 2, and so on and so forth. And what you're basically saying is that your entities are just bags of components. So maybe entity 0 has all 3 components, and entity 1 maybe only has the first 2. Maybe entity 2 only has the third one. And the way that you run your updates is you actually say, I'm going to start with all of components, all my component zeros. I'm just going to go ahead and run the update for all of those components. Then I'm going to go to component 1 and then run the update for all of those components. And then we're going to do component 3 and we're going to run the update for all of those components. And what you're basically treating each entity at, your entities are basically now just kind of split up into different update chunks. And what you're really more cared about is almost like systems. I have a system that is all of my components of type C0, and I want to figure out what's going on in their world first. And then I have another system that's all of the components of type C1, and I want to like update them all and see what's going on in terms of that system. So this is the way I kind of see it most frequently done.
Okay.
Cool. All right, so that was a long kind of thing about how this can get organized. Maybe we should put it into practice and just try to type it out.
Let's give it a shot, yeah.
Yeah, so Dom, do you have any ideas, any thoughts about this right now? Or is it just kind of like, well, whatever, we'll just kind of figure out exactly what we want to do by typing it out?
I think I think our game probably takes... I'm wondering how many component types we're going to have, and if we want like to specify that, or if we want to like make that order part of the update function where it like tries to get all components of type X and do that in order.
Right.
I think it makes sense to have the game have a list of every component type we're going to have, and that might be where we end up with like, we have like a tile collider and a non-tile collider that gets added as the collider to an entity or something. So like maybe that's where there's a list of collider types that contain 2 types of object. Maybe.
Right.
We'll see.
Yes. List of collider types that contain 2 different entities. Is that what you're saying? Or
no, like the game object has a a component list called collisions, and it contains the wall tile line colliders. It also contains like the ground, like the playfield's like pixel based colliding.
Right.
But they all conform to like this collision object, which is like does it affect the player, or does it affect like another entity or something?
Got it.
Maybe. I'm not super convinced. But
Okay.
I think let's stick it in game and see what comes out.
Okay. So in game, we currently have our entity stuck in an entity manager. And then what the entity manager does is something relatively simple. It just iterates over all the entities and calls update on them. So if we wanted to split things into components without doing too much violence to this, what it would, I think, look like is, I think, something more like this model up here, right? Where the entity manager is kind of iterating over E0, then E1, then E2, and then each entity does some updating here.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Right. We could use that pretty easily. Yes.
So what is interesting though is that the component system also solves another problem that we haven't mentioned yet, which is one of finding other entities or finding other components that you care about, right? And so one example is that maybe you have like a like wall collider component that cares about finding all of the wall components, right? And the way that you would do that in this model is you would basically, each time you're looking for a particular component type, you'd iterate over every single entity and say, hey, do you have a wall? Do you have a wall component? And if so, you're a wall, right? Now, in this model down here, what you can just do is have a list of all the wall components like exposed at the game level. And in that sense, you don't have to do any kind of iteration over entities, right? You'll just say, show me all of the wall components, something like that, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
But why don't we actually just try to evolve there, right? Just also for the sake of me no longer just talking so much. Why don't we try to get there by sort of iteratively updating this structure?
I think that makes sense. Yeah, it'll be nice, and it's nice that that's a step along the path to the more distributed version.
Okay. So I do think that we're actually probably due for making a base entity class. How do you feel about that?
I'm okay with that. Do you think it contains
Okay.
like kind of the constructor, I guess?
Yeah. So let's go ahead and create an entity class and see how far this is going to take us. And do entities render themselves as well? They do have a render, right?
Yep,
And in fact,
render.
we actually have a notion of an entity so far, right? It's this.
Yep.
Should I just do all of these things?
Yeah, you can. If you implement identity, you'll get it.
Yeah.
It'll guide you there.
Okay. And then we were saying that basically our entities are just bags of components.
Yep, correct.
And so we're probably going to have some kind of notion of this, right? iComponent.
I think so.
Okay. And then our update might be as simple as saying this dot components dot for each. Oops. Something, it'll end up looking kind of like that, right?
That makes sense, yeah.
Okay. Cool. So now we need to make an iComponent, right?
Yeah, probably in common.
And a component is just a thing that's updating. Otherwise, it's totally generic, right?
Does it need a render as well, or are we letting every subclass do that essentially?
So that is an interesting question. Normally, I would consider a render as a particular type of update on a particular type of component. So if you think about it, like we could have a component that's like the renderable component, right? And it renders itself in a 3D space or a 2D space, or we could have a component that renders itself into the UI plane or something like that, right? But we could have a render on the component, and then what it basically looks like is like a component really just a tiny sub-entity of an entity, right? It's almost as if like everything that we have ends up having an update and render function, right? The game has an update and render function. The entity manager has an update and render function. Entities have update and render, and then component would have an update and render, right? So I actually think if we start with just having an update on component, we can kind of, I think, maybe get away with not having render, and we can also tease out what maybe is good and bad about the model that we're pursuing right now.
Cool. Okay.
Okay. All right. Need a constructor on our entity class, and we need to set up some of these things, right? It's vec2.create. And we'll need to figure out exactly what we'll do with the render. Okay, so we'll need to also add components. Something like that. And then the player can extend entity now, right? And our game just crashed because this isn't gonna compile yet. Yeah.
A little bit missing.
Yep. And we do want to call the super. Is that how you do? Yes. Okay. And then a lot of this stuff goes away, right? We already did this.
Correct.
In the base class, right? Do we think that this dot orientation is pi over 2 is something that makes sense for all entities by default? I think 0 is fine.
Yeah, because that's pointing right. We don't need that.
Right. All right. So that's cool. What happens if we have an update in this class? Does it just overwrite this update here?
Well, that probably.
It looks like it is, right?
Because it still works. Yeah.
Yeah. And then let's just see if this is even getting called. Yeah. Not getting called, but if we were to comment all of this out, oh boy, it's quite a bit. Yeah, and you can see it's now calling it, every frame, basically.
Yep. Cool.
All right, so the goal is to get all this stuff into components, right? So let's start with maybe, well, we kind of have to do everything, right? So one thing we could start with is just call it the player component, something crazy like that. And then go from there, right?
You think,
and I'm just gonna actually,
is that movement, like basically movement, actually, it's the keyboard.
Yeah, I'm gonna actually maybe make one Uber component and tease that component out just so this works. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. Export. We don't even need to export this, right? We'll call it the player Uber component to know that we actually want to refactor this pretty soon. And maybe what we're going to do is actually copy some of this stuff.
Okay, it's just getting everything. Great. Yep.
And pretty much we can just copy this whole thing. Let's see if I can. How crazy can I make this? doesn't let me select while going to the next closing match and closing brace. It's too bad. Let me just go ahead and grab all of this stuff. It's right there. Cool. So that would allow us to basically get rid of the update function in the player itself, which we have done, right? So now what's interesting is that I think we've got some stuff that is on the entity class, right?
Right.
But that we really want to move into, or we want to give this player Uber component access to this stuff.
Right. So should a component take the entity itself? Do we want the entity to hold on to these like position globals, or does it have a position component that actually it goes and asks for?
Yeah. So this is I think this gets down to one of the key structuring questions about this style of design, which is how do components know about each other, or how do they know about other pieces of state that are on the entity? And I asked the question earlier, is a component state or is it logic? And we kind of said sometimes one, sometimes the other, sometimes both, right? So the question is like, if there's state inside a component, should the entity class have any state on it directly, right? Should we have this stuff here
at all,
or is this stuff even, or at the very least, like, are these two things, position, orientation, should those things be considered to be state on the entity?
It's a good question. The thing that's going to need to interact with that is like right now there's the movement component and the collision component of the player both need to access this somehow.
Yeah.
And the wall component probably needs to access the position of other walls, essentially.
Yeah.
So it is nice to be able to ask, like, where are you?
Exactly. And, there's a couple of other things that are happening there. So we can actually just follow the red squiggles that VS Code is giving us right now. It's asking us, like, to figure out how can this Uber component know about position if the position isn't part of the Uber component itself, right? And then the other thing that we need to figure out is how to discover other entities. And we didn't even bother answering this question last stream because all of our other entities were walls, and we just made the assumption that they were all just walls, right? But we are going to have to answer the question when we have other things like bullets and that sort of thing. We're going to have to ask the question, of the entities that we're iterating over, and we're doing this iteration here, which one of those are the ones that I care about when I'm doing terrain collision, right? So two kind of different questions. One, how do I access state either on the entity or on other components that are part of the same entity? And then the second question is, how do I access state for particular component types on other entities, right?
I think component as a object maybe needs to take the entity in its constructor so we can at least count on position.
Yeah.
I think we'll be happy with that.
Sense.
And I think game should maybe become a global import instead of something that we make entity manage.
Right. Well, I think game could be a global import. It could also just be that we pass it into the constructor everywhere, which is, I think, not the worst thing.
But then every component also, like, you need to pass it from the entity to the component constructors.
Right. The other thing we could do
is like a lot.
The other thing we could do is make it available in the update function, right? We can pass in, like,
we
can pass the game in there, right? Um,
I kind of like that more than having something keep a pointer to it the whole time.
yeah, and then what if the component was, rather than being this, what if it was... How do we do the map syntax again?
Kind of look it up every time.
Yeah. What else has this? We had something that had this.
Something in common, I bet. Common's where our
I
types
think it
are.
was the entity manager has it, right? Yeah, there we go.
Yep.
So what if we tagged the components by their type, right? And this, the assumption here is that you only have one type of component, or one of each type of component for each entity, which I think is an okay restriction to have up front, right?
So sorry, so that can that string be an enum instead, like key component type?
Yeah, we could totally do that.
Yeah,
that's a great
idea.
idea.
I'm trying to wrap my head around what those will be.
Okay. So what if I just made a giant components file? And what if I called one the I'm trying to get something that like represents the position. I want to take this stuff out of the entity.
Okay.
Will we call that like world pause or something like that? Transform is the typical thing that you see. But it's a little bit hostile of a name. So what do you think? Do we go by convention, or do we go by something a little bit clearer?
I can get used to transform.
Okay, we'll call it transform.
Yeah.
Implements iComponent, and then we need to make sure we get that interface. So the type checker is happy. And there's an update function. Maybe we're saying that it takes the game.
I really like that, yeah.
And maybe it also takes the, or maybe it takes the entity. And the entity has the game on it, right? And then we're saying it has these two things, or rather these two things.
And a type of transform, I guess. Because I think what you're getting at is that eventually you want to be able to say, like, from the collider component, I want to ask the game or the entity for this entity's transform component. Look it up by type. Yeah, exactly. You get the position.
So it needs a type, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and actually you need more than that, because the transform class implement iComponent you need to cast it to like an iComponent transform to be able to access like position orientation safely. Because just getting it back as a generic component won't give us what we want.
That's kind of nasty, isn't it? Right.
Yeah, I've done this with Redux action typing, where you can actually like give it a really nice like. You can get into the action specifics in a generic interface. I think it involves passing generic, like component should actually be parameterized. The interface to take a type.
You're saying that it should be something like iComponent T, kind of thing.
Yeah. That's not the right thing, but yeah.
Got it. Yeah. And then probably what you do is you end up doing a lot of downcasting, right? You just like assume that if the key is of a particular value, like if it's like the string transform, then you can just assume that when that was set up, you only ever assign that to a transform component, right?
Okay, wait, check this out. Here, I think, is how you would do that. Yeah, got my keyboard. I think this is actually where you stop being generic and you say transform is an iComponent transform. Oops. So we no longer have generic keys. We have a bunch of optional keys, essentially.
Oh, that's really cool.
That are components that can form, that you can type as a transform component. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I get you. Let's do that.
Sweet.
That makes a lot of sense.
Relinquishing keyboard control.
And it's really, we can just do this, right? It doesn't even need to be an interface. We can just inherit this thing. And we don't need the enum anymore, right? I don't think.
Correct.
Okay. It's going to be a little while before this code's going to compile again. But when it does, it'll be amazing. And is it, how do we make it nullable? Is it a question mark here?
After the first transform, before the colon.
Oh, that makes it optional, right?
Yeah.
So it cannot be null. It can only be, like, it's just fully undefined, right?
Yeah, I think that might also be nullable. No, nullable is transform or null.
Yeah. Got it. And then the update here, given that structure, is interesting.
I mean, the for each already didn't. The for each stopped working a second ago, so it's gotta be like object.keys, this components for each.
Yeah. So we could do, we could do the for let k in this dot components. This dot components k dot update. And we pass this, right? Oh my god, it compiles.
Wow.
The tricky thing about this is that our update order is now pretty arbitrary, right?
But this could be this dot components dot transform dot update, this dot component dot. It's a bummer there's no safe access operator in TypeScript. You know what? There might be. What version of TypeScript are we running? Serious
3.8.3?
Oh, I think they shipped it in 3.7, yeah.
It'll just like not call functions if...
Yeah.
Question mark dot?
I think so. This did ship. TypeScript 3.7, you can use optional chaining, which means you can call this component dot transform question mark dot update.
Got it.
And if there's no transform, it just doesn't call, which is actually awesome.
This is awesome.
Yeah.
This is really cool. Okay, so now we can go to our components and we can just say we're getting the entity, and what does this update actually do for the transform? We do nothing here, right?
Right. So really, this is just holding. That's our container for having a position and an orientation.
Exactly. So this is all. This is the all state no logic example.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Although, do you think that it might be useful to do this step, and that every transform knows its previous position?
Oh yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Okay. So what we're saying here is there's a previous position.
And since we run this first, every component gets its. Yep. Do you want that in the constructor, or you want that in update? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
So are you saying that's null?
You might as well set it. You might as well
Okay.
construct it, because otherwise you'll have a strange thing.
Yeah. And then what's it complaining about here? We have a common interface that hasn't been updated yet.
Great.
Okay. So this is going to start to, I think, come into a little bit of color here. What's it complaining about now? Entity.
No position. But you should give entity that components object in the common.
Say that one more time.
This interface needs the components object that takes a transform of type transform. Yeah.
Ah, yes. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of duplication, right? I guess we could
sort of
struct components.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is it just this? Is that how that works?
Yeah. I think it's still an interface.
Oh, and it's gonna have to like import all the different component types here.
Right, which is maybe we want. Once again, we're gonna end up defining an interface type for every matching type, but that's okay.
Okay.
We did it for everything else so far.
What's that?
We've done it for everything else so far, so.
Yeah, but that is. Ugh. You're right. That I think we have to solve this in some shape or form, no matter what, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, that's rough. Because basically, what we're saying is that if we want to be able to read state off of everything, we're gonna have to have like an I transform, right?
Correct.
That has these three things in it.
Well, only maybe. I think.
Well, we would because
we could define a new file, a new type. It's tough that transform knows about entity. That really is sort of what makes this annoying.
Yeah, well, all components know about entity, right? Even
Yeah.
the base component class or the component interface,
right?
Which I tucked here, knows about entity.
Hmm. Right. So how can we safely import this components interface? You could export this interface from components TS. I think you get a circular import at that point, but
yeah.
For types, it might be okay. Because it's not a circular import, it's just TypeScript resolves it. Like it's the weird part of the system where TypeScript is not JavaScript.
Right. Is this if we were doing Java, how does Java deal with like circular references? I feel like Java doesn't care. It figures it out.
I think it figures it out, yeah.
Yeah. So this is a funny thing that I find myself running into a lot with TypeScript in particular, is this kind of like circular import problem. And it may just be because I'm not very well practiced in it. But the fact that I have to sort of like double define everything is pretty onerous, right?
Yeah. And I haven't found a strong way out of this pattern yet.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's okay.
Yeah.
So the idea here is we have like an I transform. So we're saying this is an interface.
Must be right around this. This is probably why I see so many things that are just like I versions of every object, though.
Well, I'm just gonna kind of power on through.
Okay, let's just do it. Yeah.
And I think this kind of means we don't need like a base component anymore, do we? If we're gonna basically have one of these for every component type,
Mm-hmm.
we don't even need this anymore, right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Okay. And now that that's there, why don't I just call this the transform, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is just going to care about I. It's going to care about components. Well, how does this look so far?
Transform. I'm digging it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I dig it too. So a player Uber component, let's abandon that idea just for now, because we're already kind of like out of the Uber component zone.
Mm-hmm.
What we do have here in the player entity is interesting, right? What we're saying is this dot components dot transform equals new concrete transform, right?
Yes.
And then
Does that take a... That just sets its own default orientation and position, yeah. Wow.
and then the transform.
Yeah.
Oh, it happened. That's cool. Okay, so we're going to take this one component painfully at a time, right? And this is now complaining. Transform dot position. Wait, this is dot orientation, right?
Now, should these just be the default values? Yeah.
They could be the default values if you want to make sure that everything's oriented upwards by default.
Well, just that, you know...
Or we just delete these, right?
Yeah, just like let transform... Like, put that in the transform constructor and call it a day.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So what do we want to do now? We want to basically take all this stuff that I moved up here into separate components, right? So now we have kind of this keyboard handling thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're really doing two different things. We are...
I think the keyboard should be the global object. I think you handled that in the other game as well.
Yeah. So you're saying the keyboard maybe should just be in game?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a shared... Yeah, we can ask the game what keys are down in the key down set or something.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's do that really quick.
Yep. Because other things will want this, I'm sure.
So fundamentally, what is the keyboard?
It's really just a set.
And what is the type that we're adding to this? Do you know? Is it an int? I think it's just number, right?
I think it's a number.
Okay. and then the game has a keyboard. And let's assume there's no update function for this for now, right?
Yeah, and there can't be. The keyboard is event driven.
Yeah.
Instead of game loop driven, so we can't actually do that.
Yeah. I can imagine this needing to be a little bit more complicated if I think all of these events will get run in between our game frames, because I don't think there's anything in our game frames that will surrender control of the event loop, right? So
Probably true. Yeah.
yeah, all of our updates are happening in a single threaded fashion with no preemption. However, if we did end up doing like async await stuff inside the update, which I probably think we should avoid doing, then we'll probably need to make this keyboard thing a little bit more complicated, or else we're going to see potentially multiple keyboard states within the same frame, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's nice that the way it's evented, though. In fact, we probably will get a completely stable keyboard set.
Yeah.
For every loop.
Yeah. Okay. So
let's see. So 33 through 42 are gone.
Yeah, that's gone. And then we need basically what did we do here? Is this us doing tile alignment?
Starting position, I thought.
Yeah. Yep. So that's basically what we need to move over to player initialization, right? I think that was just it, right? Okay.
I think so. I can't tell because it's not on the screen still, but I think it was.
There's a lot of behaviors that we're trying to tease out here, right? The behaviors in particular are moving and rotating based on keyboard input, right? Firing and instantiating bullets, and colliding against walls.
Yes.
Right? Okay. All right. So let's dig into that a little bit. So how about moving around as the first thing that we worry about?
Sounds great.
Or maybe let's actually get this thing rendering again. How about that's an even more important thing, right?
Yeah.
Let's draw the player.
And are we just not calling render right now? Is that actually what's?
Yeah. What's happening right now is the entity manager is probably not compiling right now. Is that the issue?
Entity manager might be good. The player might not.
Well, I guess it's not finding some of these things. It's probably just crashing, right? I wonder if we just did this dot transform, this dot components dot transform, right? B is undefined.
B. In vec2.jet, this dot components dot transform dot position.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, we've got something in here, right? This
Great.
is This is rendering in the middle.
Uh-huh. It's a strange spot, but it's working.
Oh, you know what it is?
Huh.
Where are we? We're doing some spawning in game, right? We're like reading the map.
Yeah, oh, there it is, new player, and we don't actually tell it. We didn't actually tell it what coordinates spawning on. That's annoying. Wait. Oh, ending a position. Sorry. Entity dot components dot transform dot position.
Yes. So, Dom, if we're doing components, if we're doing components like this, it feels like all this is doing for us, this components interface, is saving us from having to type the individual components twice, once in iEntity and the other in the concrete player class.
Yeah, it opens up the possibility for us to have a like unlimited number of components by putting a index type on this, but otherwise, yeah, I agree.
So what if we did this?
Sure. Yeah, why not?
And that just means we're going to have to double type everything here, right?
And I think we should lose that 100 there. Okay, so our game is not still not setting correctly.
Yeah.
Because of that. Yep.
Okay. It still didn't quite figure it out.
Yeah, there are a lot of errors now, though.
Yeah.
So let's see.
I think it's not compiling, right?
Must be. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's not compiling. Entity.transform is not defined right here.
You need to do a save access operator.
Got it, because not all of our...
Not everything has transform yet. Do we not have that turned on?
Yeah.
I wonder if we need to enable that with something in our TS config.
Well, it just says that you cannot have optional access on the left-hand side of an assignment. That's the error message.
Yeah. So I guess just a guard then.
Yeah. So I've been trying to save a punchline through this process.
Okay.
But maybe it's time to do it now, because I do think that what's that?
What's the punchline?
The punchline is that like what's going to end up happening is like for every single behavior that we have, there's going to be position here. There's going to be like keyboard input. There's going to be like path renderable. That's going to be doing our path rendering. There's going to be uh, wall component. There's going to be like wall collidable.
Hmm.
This is going to go on and on and on, right?
Right. I don't feel like we've made a generic interface except that we expect, well, like, is it that we expect a collider? Like, is there what? I think colliders the only one where I've seen like two types for the same thing. Otherwise, it's like, yeah, a bunch of components. There's a shooter, that sort of
Yeah.
stuff.
There's going to be a shooter. There's going to be a hittable by bullet. And these are all fine. I don't disagree with like these concepts being there,
Mm-hmm.
but we haven't. I think we still have the Uber entity class. I think that was the punchline that I was getting towards.
Yep. Yeah.
And all we've really done is made certain pieces of functionality nullable. But we have still kind of like created this class that basically has all possible capabilities at once. And we actually want to have that. Like an entity should be able to do everything.
Mm-hmm.
The question is like just like where do you actually express that?
Well, I think this was the place to keep the components in there so that the entity file was kept light.
Yes.
And then we could define an order of keys to access elsewhere for what order to run the components in. Yeah.
Right.
But I'm okay if we do this today because, like, really, that's just some TypeScript shenanigans.
It is, yeah. Okay,
once we
can continue to try to like just sort of play this out, and then we can kind of reorganize to what I think might be a better model in a second.
Mm-hmm.
So what we want to do here is just like if entity.transform is defined, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're going for.
Do you like guard statements in TypeScript?
What are guard statements?
You can do I think there's like actually a keyword guard. Is there not? Maybe I'm thinking the wrong language. Never mind. I thought this existed in TypeScript. Nope. Okay.
There is something in something. Is that a little bit better?
No, I was looking for like the unless basically.
Yeah.
And I think I'm putting Swift in here again. So.
Right.
No worries.
So what is this complaining about? It is not I didn't notice my change here. Try this one more time. Okay, there we go. It just did not figure it out. So our walls need to see a similar change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our walls need to, like player, extend entity.
Mm-hmm.
We get rid of some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Should we get rid of everything here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Transform. Okay, our walls are drawing again, at least.
Yes. Can you hit him?
We definitely can't hit him yet. I think there's a fair amount of that we need to have. But it's and we need an update for the wall right now. I think there's a base update anyways, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is this complaining about? Oh, super, of course. How's that? All right, got the wall drawing again. Let's get the player back in. And now let's do maybe motion.
Okay. Yep.
Let's call it player control.
Hmm.
And we're just going to copy our other existing component here. And this doesn't necessarily have any state at all, right?
Correct. It might be parameterized in terms of like, given the player control, what do we do? Like it needs to know about speed, basically. Or just pass that in.
It needs to know about the transform.
I guess I was going to say player speed is its state, essentially. Even if it exists only in this function, but I do think it's stateful.
And this is firing. I'm going to put firing back in here.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, put that with shooter. Mm-hmm.
And then what we're saying is if this dot, or it's really entity dot game dot keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I renamed that. And we need a key map. So pull that up. Just updating all of these pointers here so that they're going through the transform now.
But it's entity.transform.position.
Yes, you're right. And iGame does not have the keyboard on it, right?
I thought we created a new keyboard.
We added it to the class, we just didn't add it to the...
Correct.
Oh god, and we need to add like iKeyboard, don't we?
Sweet.
Alright. So I think that's actually kind of going to be the way I level up on TypeScript here, is figuring out how to deal with this particular problem, right?
I would love to come up with something clever for it, yeah.
Okay, moving right along. We're doing player control, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the speed actually exists. It's not, we never record it anywhere. We just update the position directly.
We had a play, sorry, beyond that, you mean?
We just have a constant.
Yeah. Right, there is no existing velocity or something.
Yeah. And then tile size is in common, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And now we need to add player control to the player, right? So there's a series of places where this needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have this anymore, right? And then entity needs it. Oh boy. This is amazing. And then we need to take player control. And player control, it just has an update basically, right?
Yep.
So all this really needs to be is, where am I putting all of my components? It just needs this, right?
Yes. You might be able to get away without exporting that interface. I'm not sure we used it elsewhere. Same for transform. Because later on we instantiate a transform class and stick it on there.
We have to export it because the entity class needs to be able to like at least do this. Yeah.
Right. Dang.
It's like a TypeScript thing, right?
Yep.
Man, this is wild.
Yeah, we're gonna come up with a better version for this.
Right.
It's manageable.
That's the problem with games, is this one giant circular reference. Okay, but we do have a player control component now that's written correctly. So what we want to do is in the player class, we want to actually create it, right?
Mm-hmm.
New player control. And then in the entity class, this dot player control dot update this. And now does it work? Oh my god, it works. That's pretty cool, right?
Excellent. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So shooter, right?
Shooter. Yeah.
So now that we've got a couple of these under our belt, we're going to get better and better at this, right?
It's a lot of places to add stuff right now. That's a real bummer.
Yeah. And shooter does have some state, but maybe it can be totally internal to that component, right? We don't need to add anything else that you don't need to read from. Like all this stuff here in the interface here is stuff that other components might care about reading.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think either of these have any kind of like external state that anybody else cares about, right?
Yep. So that's interesting. So could both of those just be I components? Really
they very much could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I generic component or something like that. Do I have an I component already? I think I got rid of it. So why don't I call it I generic component?
Do it.
Okay, rename symbol.
Nice.
And I can get rid of this.
Yep.
All right, this feels a little bit better now, right? There's a little bit less repetition.
I'm happier now.
Okay, slightly happier. This will get a lot cleaner, I think, as we clean it up. I believe. And now we need the concrete instance of that, right? So let's go to keyboard control, player control, and let's just copy this to shooter.ts, right? And then we'll go to the player and just pull out all the shooter related stuff. This doesn't exist anymore, so it's really kind of this. And then this.
Yep, the remaining up to it. Yep.
And then it takes the game, right? Or it takes the entity. And really, space, I think this should actually be fire. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This .key down is entity.game.keyboard.down keys, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, what the hell? Okay. This dot is all entity dot, except this one. Entity dot transform dot position. And then we need to import bullet.
Hey. Okay. Can you fire?
All right. Can't fire yet.
Ah, so close.
So close. Am I updating it correctly?
I bet player doesn't call shooter.update. Nope. Damn. Does player create a shooter?
Let's see if shooter.update is even getting called.
What does player.ts needs to instantiate the shooter object?
I see what you're saying. Yes,
Yeah.
I totally see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
We're back in business.
Love it. Oh yeah, we are.
Slowly but surely. Okay. Cold fold. Code fold. Okay, this is starting to feel a little bit better, right? Gradually-ish.
I think so.
Okay. Now here is the really tricky one, which is wall collision. Let's just get this all into a separate component. So let's see here. I think it's going to be another generic wall collider.
Tile collider, wall collider.
Let's call it wall collider for now because all we can collide against is walls, and then we can make it more generic after that point. And then the entity needs to do this, right? What?
another generic? Yeah.
Yeah. Stop. Wall collider. And I actually think that maybe we should do collision update before we shoot.
Whoa. Wow. Yep, sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm going to take the shooter and I'm going to copy this and I'm going to call it the wall collider. And I don't know if this has any state.
No, I think it just needs to access the transform safely.
Yeah. So I guess really it's just this thing in everything that's left over in the Uber component. Still Uber, but not as much as before. This dot position all becomes entity.transform.position. Previous position is entity.transform.previous position. All this dots are all entity dot. It needs to import direction. Is that common?
Yes.
Tile box is from tile math. Entity.id.
That should still work. we take away entity ID? No.
Do we have a let entity anywhere? Did we accidentally... Are we shadowing that variable anywhere? I don't think we are. Maybe it's just confused. Wall collider 1513. Oh, here.
Yep.
Ah, that's tricky. This is the other entity, right?
Yeah. So it could be check. Like check and checkbox.
Sorry, say that one more time.
Could just call that, instead of entity, that's the thing we're checking, right? Other, I like other box, yeah.
Yeah. Got it. And so that means this entity, this entity, this entity is all the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the other one. And then maybe let's just call this other box, just to make it consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And then player box let's call it my box.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, this entity is probably all my positions here are dot transform dot positions.
Mm-hmm.
Oops. And here we're assuming that the other entities have a transform, and we'll deal with that in a second. Where's equals? Is this all stuff that we...
Tile math, yeah.
Okay. And vec2 tile size. We're just fixing up all the type issues right now.
Mm-hmm. It's so close to colliding, though. It's about
so close. Collision so far. Any
Is
errors?
this part of update?
Are we updating it?
Yeah.
Wall collider is getting updated.
Hmm. And is it
We're not
getting-
adding it to the player.
Yeah, it's not getting instantiated. Safe navigation operators are too safe.
I like it. Oh my god. We are back to normal.
Sweet. Hey, that's great. And the player class is so much shorter.
And, oh, but as soon as we shoot a bullet, it crashes.
What?
Um,
Wait, I can't see that. That's wild.
okay. Other dot transform. What doesn't have a oh, the bullets don't have a transform because the bullets are not componentized yet.
There we go.
So here's an interesting thing. Our wall collider algorithm here assumes that every other entity is a wall. Right? All we do is we iterate over all the entities.
Right. And it should filter on maybe type or...
I think we should have a component called wall, and if it's not defined, we'll just skip it. Does that make sense?
Oh. Yeah, if not entity.wall. Yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So we're going to just go through the boilerplate here.
And so it's really interesting because wall is like a null component.
It doesn't have to be, right? Because a lot of the access line bounding boxes and all those things we're pulling off of that may be something that we want the component to know about, right?
We could generate all that in that component for it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. This dot wall equals new wall. Oh, this is the problem. Is the component name and the
Right.
Which we don't have yet. This doesn't do anything, right? And then com.ts. Actually, it's just generic component that implements, right? Because it's generic.
Unless we need to get the bounding box off, in which case it starts being a wall of some sort. Like if we need the state.
And this needs to implement an update. Which does nothing. Okay, and then in our wall collider, we have some skip logic here. If it's the same entity, we won't collide against it. I think we could actually update this to if entity.wall is undefined.
Then continue. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So now we've restored order. We can shoot bullets now.
Nice.
Oh, but we don't collide right now for some reason. Or is the wall creating the wall?
Wait, do walls have walls, and do players have wall colliders?
Players have wall colliders because it was colliding before. Walls have walls.
Walls have walls.
What's the problem here? And I think just for the sake of completeness, we're going to do a wall update. Even though it does nothing.
Sure.
And the wall collider, oh, not entity.wall, if we want to get other here, this is the problem. We were looking at the wrong thing. So now we should be colliding. Oh yeah, cool.
Nice.
Okay, so we have done a bunch of stuff to get back to where we were before. But what's great is I think we can actually now pretty easily convert the bullet into an entity that looks like this, and then get the bullet to collide against walls, nice. Which is exciting. Let's get started on that. So, bullet extends regular old entity, right? And I think we can get rid of all this stuff. The constructor actually takes some things. We want it to have a transform, right?
And it has not a shooter, but a shot component. I don't know.
It could just be a bullet component.
Yeah. Bullet mover.
Or oh right, because it has this thing, right? Interesting.
And then on top of that, it basically gets a wall collider and is maybe done. Yeah. Resolution has gotten fairly choppy for the end of this. It was pretty good for the first hour 45, though.
Yeah. Check this out. Let me try something that's a little bit sneaky. And I think this is actually okay for components.
You're going to let the bullet have its own update?
Exactly. So...
Yeah. Makes sense.
Let's call it the script.
It's unique behavior.
Let's call it the script. And the script is the last thing that will get updated.
Neat.
And this basically just encompasses, it's like a catch-all for all kind of custom stuff, right? And what we're going to do for the bullet is we're going to create this thing. Just takes the entity. And it'll basically just have this whole update function, right? And then it'll also have a constructor, which also has this state in here, right?
Yep, perfect. Ah, that's clever.
And then all these this dots, all these thises are, at this point, the entity, and all the positions are actually transformed oppositions. And the orientation is also transformed out of orientation, right? And so now the bullet has a transform. It has a script. And it also has a wall collider, right?
Oh, shit. I see what's about to happen.
And the render has to be transform.orientation, transform.position, and both shoot. And unfortunately, they do not hit the walls yet. I was just kind of hoping for like a money shot right there, where it would just kind of like hit the walls. Oh, you know what it is? Is it still might be hitting the walls? We're just not.
Like, what does it do when it hits? Nothing, right?
Yeah, exactly. The script needs to know that, right?
Oh, gosh, yeah. Does that mean wall collider needs some state?
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to know somehow that a hit happened.
Hit last frame is a bool. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me.
And then if there, basically it's all these returns here. Where do we actually detect the collision?
It's in this. The collided for each, if collided contains items, we return something.
Yeah, if basically there was anything in the collided, right?
Yeah.
So we could even do it down here, right? This dot hit last frame equals collided dot length greater than 0. And I think wall collider can no longer be generic now, right? Because we need to know all this stuff.
Right. Yeah, now it's an eye wall collider.
Yeah. And also has an update. Eye wall collider. Entity is the same. Wall collider, and then the wall collider component implements wall collider. And now the bullet says, the script says, if this dot wall collider, if entity dot wall collider, right?
Mhm.
Hit last frame. Entity.games. Entities. Mark for deletion. This.
Mhm.
Or entity. And do we just return at this point?
Yeah, we can.
When we just shouldn't move the thing,
Yeah.
right? Okay, bummer. Still no collisions. This is solvable though. I think we're getting warmer and warmer, right?
Can we log entity wall collider in this update? I get the feeling it's maybe not.
Entity dot constructor. So bullet is getting logged in there. Can you see that? I don't know if you can see that.
You're printing what's hitting. Great. That's yeah.
Oh, I was printing whether or not wall collider was actually registering.
Do the bullets move too fast for our collisions?
Great question. Let's slow the bullets down, shall we?
Yeah. I don't think they do, because they're still fairly slow, but let's find out.
Yeah, they don't move too fast.
Cool.
Is there something about this that assumes that we're the player here? So get all entities colliding with this entity. Get all walls. We get my box. Well, one thing about this is that we're assuming that the collision volume for the bullet is the axis-aligned tile-size bounding box of the bullet, which is actually okay, I would say.
I mean, that should be bigger. It should be even harder to miss, right? Like.
Yeah, exactly. And then we're going to iterate over all the entities in the game, and we're going to find the entities that are walls. We're going to get the other, basically the walls box. Just going to rename this to wall box. Is it bad that we're clobbering entity right here? Probably is, right?
Probably. Yeah, I wonder. It should. Gosh, that should be safely namespaced, but who knows?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I don't think it should be clobbering.
Wait. Oh. No, the bullets are just dying.
The bullets were going through, yeah. Sorry if the refresh rate is slow on your side, but...
Yeah, the time to live for them now that they're slower, they time out halfway through the wall, so it looks like. That's okay.
I doubled the TTL, so
nice.
Should be pretty clear now.
Ooh, it is so clear that it's not happening.
So clear. Gosh.
Indeed. What else have we got? So do we see collided show up in, like, does anything show up on line 51? Can we like start logging that?
Yeah.
Like, we know that when you fire a bullet, even this makes it through. Beautiful.
So what is our condition here?
I mean, if true would be good right now because we should only see that log when the bullet passes through, and if we don't, we know that.
True, true.
Okay, so we never got here.
Yep.
But if you run into that, you should see it very fast. Huh. Wait, does the player still collide, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay.
Player does, and we get a bunch of our logs there. So the player collides.
Huh.
And we know that it is running, at least, for the bullets as well, because we saw it in the logs. So there's something weird about this logic here.
Oh, open up the tile math. Did I do something silly here?
It's pretty generic.
Okay. Yeah, it should be
pretty good.
Should just be an extra big bounding box for a bullet, which is fine.
Mm-hmm.
That's weird.
So one thing that'd be cool to start getting into. We don't quite have things. We don't have things that are quite factored this way yet, but it would be nice to be able to render the axis aligned boxes
Yeah,
onto
you can
the
see it
screen
happen.
itself. Right.
Agreed. That'd be really cool. Well.
Well,
Bummer.
we know the positions are working,
Yeah.
right?
I like
And
that
then-
we're back to where we are with a bunch of refactor components, and we don't have the new functionality, but nothing is less than it was.
Does the bullet? The bullet has a transform. Okay, cool.
Yeah, it has a wall collider and a bullet script.
Mm-hmm.
It seems very close. I bet the next time we open this up, we'll figure it out in 5 minutes. And or debug.
And I've already kind of forgotten a lot of this logic in here, right? It's complex enough that like it doesn't quite sit in the brain super easily.
Yeah, and all this like edge detection is fairly strange. It's hard to think about.
I would like to at least know if there's a way we can debug that we know it's a wall. Oh, sorry, that we know it's a bullet.
Mm-hmm.
And since we don't have any tagging yet, I'm not typing right now. I want to let you do your thing.
I didn't do a thing. Did it take over?
Yeah, it was kind of
sorry.
scrolling through for a little while.
Sorry.
No problem.
I wish there's not a great indicator when this thing's happening.
Got it. So one way we can do this is, I think one way that we know that we're dealing with a bullet is that it has a script component, right? We don't have like tags yet or strings or anything that we can compare against, but we know that bullets have scripts, right? So if entity dot script is not undefined, then we can do some debugging in here, right?
That seems reasonable, yeah.
We're gonna get a ton of stuff here.
Well, fire a single bullet if you can. Hey, there we go.
Yeah.
So see, that's interesting. Wait, it also... Oh, we actually can't say that it collided. Huh.
So this just checks to see if there's an overlap, right? And I bet at the very least we'll get in here,
I
right?
think
Let
so.
me at least try to do this.
Right, because what we got was a bullet not hitting the wall, and the wall.
Yeah. Okay, so I did notice you might not have been able to see it real time, but I did see it at least enter this.
Okay.
Right, because we're logging it all, right? With like the fact that we're seeing text at all right now.
Right,
means
it
that we
shouldn't
got
have printed if it didn't think that it was inside the other thing.
Right.
Can we look at two of the boxes there?
It's really just the top two that we care about, right?
Sure. Yeah. The first two should be the indicative ones because nothing should have made it past that.
Yep. Okay, so the upper left corner of the bullet is 47.5, 149-ish, and the lower right corner is 71.5, 172.5-ish.
Okay, so it's crossing the upper left corner is hitting the lower right corner of the wall with that. 47, 48, and 148 inside 168. So we've collided. And it should be the east wall. Probably the east wall.
Yeah. Let me try doing this again where we're just let's make it very definitive what wall it should be hitting, right?
Okay. You can take out everything but one wall, or
it should just be the south wall.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I'm not even getting any updates from your screen right now, though.
Oh man, that's terrible.
I know, it goes in and out. It's very unfortunate. Some of this debugging was very clear.
Is anything getting updated now? Do you see the console?
I see. Yep.
Okay. So one thing I will say is interesting is that do you notice that the wall that we hit, its upper left corner is the x coordinate 72? But the upper left corner of the bullet has an x coordinate of 93, which is a very, very big difference.
But the lower right of the wall is 96, so it's inside.
True, but if you look at the position of the tank relative to the wall, you would expect that the tile line bounding box of the bullet would be roughly at the same x coordinates as the wall.
I see. Right.
So how are we getting tile box of this thing here? And I think for extra clarity, we're going to also log the previous position of the bullet. Okay. It's weird. When it hot reloads, it loses keyboard focus and I have to click back into the window.
Annoying.
Okay. There we go. And let me expand this so these are all visible. So one thing I find interesting is that the previous position of the bullet is the same as the current position of the bullet. Do you see that?
That is interesting.
So our update order is not correct here, right? So that's the problem with doing it in the script.
Yeah.
So technically we could do this. And let's see what happens here.
Oh gosh, that's weird. I see why though. I don't like it.
All right.
Neat. That's really frustrating that we need.
Right.
Yeah,
Are we back on?
we're back on.
Okay. Well, I guess OBS crashed, so we'll see if we can get continuity with the previous stream when we do the export. But it's not
Yeah,
a huge deal.
and maybe YouTube will sort it out in the end for us.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yes. Oh yeah, I can always just stitch the two together, with computer magic. So yeah, this is actually a really instructive bug that we just kind of fought through, right? Because it basically demonstrates that one of the disadvantages of this component system is that it's not entirely clear within the update of the components themselves where the like when you read state from other components, do you know if that state's been updated or not? Right.
Yeah, and it's gonna be annoying if we can't. If script is an interesting problem because certain classes of behavior that script can do are going to be wrong no matter where we put it. So
yeah,
I wonder how to handle that. I think we actually need a mover class. I think like Bullet should have a mover that takes care of that, and players should also have a mover that takes care of moving with a key down, and movement should happen before collision, so we can deal with that.
Where the key down just sets the velocity, right? And
yeah.
So one way of doing that, which is what you're describing, is to say like we shouldn't really have generic functionality, and the updates for every component should have like a stable assumption of
correct.
Like the wall collider should assume that the transform has been updated already, right?
Right.
And it should also assume that the previous position has been updated already.
Yeah, and it is. That's why it works. So, yeah.
And there's not really a way for us to kind of declaratively say that dependency exists. I feel like I'm suddenly in React Redux land, where like we're almost looking like at wall collider being a derived kind of a piece of derived data from the positions,
That's a fun way to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. But there's no way to basically state dependencies for these components. So that's a little bit tricky, right?
Yep.
And the dependency order is basically totally dictated by what's in the base entity class.
Right.
Which is okay.
It's I like that it's consistent. I think script getting removed and replaced with something less generic will help us out. And then yeah, that's cool.
Totally.
Well, I like this refactor. This took about as long as I expected. It was complicated.
This one is definitely a little bit more in the weeds than our previous streams, but that's okay. That's kind of the way.
It's so nice to be able to drop this onto Bullet and then have wall collisions, and it's what I wanted to happen. So yeah.
So where this might eventually lead, and we talked a little bit about this at the end of last stream, is that we could go back to potentially a structure that looks like this matrix here, where really what your game is like just a list of components, and what you'd have at the game levels, you'd have the shooters, and it would be like an array of shooters, and you'd have the wall colliders, and it would be an array of wall colliders.
Right.
And that's actually not an array. I'm sorry. It is like a hash table. So, which I believe that's this awkward construct. And the key there is like an entity ID. And what we would basically do is get rid of the entity class entirely. And what you'd see in wall collider is you'd get the transform by saying game dot. Man, this autocomplete is killing me. Game.transform
for like my entity ID,
Entity ID. Yeah.
Yep.
You
That's
do something
cool.
like that. Um, and that would at least save us from having to have this intermediate class here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the update for the game would just be, it would look like this, only it'd be doing lists of it. It would be doing like this dot transform dot for each component dot update this, right? And then we'd have this dot player control, and we'd have this dot wall colliders.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then it'd be plural, right? That'd be kind of neat, right?
I like that. I'm okay with things happening in order too, individually, but yeah, I see the trade off.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's flesh this out next week and add a couple, maybe like new behaviors and try to.
Sounds good.
I want to come up with some TypeScript cleverness to unhorrify this thing. So that's my goal.
But I think it's actually a lot better now, right? Like we have actually made it so that we're at a state now where the bullet is really pretty minimal, right? We didn't have to add much. We were able to reuse our code, and we've gotten to a point where our bullets will now collide against walls, which is fantastic, right?
Yeah, and I bet if we tune our bullet collider to be a tighter rectangle, it'll actually look even better than it does right now. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
We might need to do oriented rectangle overlaps. Horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
But it'll be very cool. And then we could even do we could spawn particle emitters where the bullets hit the walls, so that you get a little kind of hits back. We can also start to damage the wall as well, right?
Yep, I'm curious about damage, which maybe involves bringing some art in, so we have like a wall and a damaged wall and a destroyed wall state. Hit points, health as a component to add to things. Yeah.
All right, cool, very cool. We've got some great ideas then for Wednesday stream.
Yeah, and an excellent groundwork to build on. So, good Sunday.
We've earned the happy face badge.
It's nice. Wonderful. We should get badges for OBS and all the trauma it inflicts on us. Cool. All right. Well, thanks, and I'll see you on Wednesday.
Okay. Take it easy, Dom.
All right. Stream stop.